the heritage industry, heaven or hell? Hello, welcome to the Contested Heritage series. My name is Richard Harwood, I'm barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And we are absolutely delighted to have today Dr. Emma Wells. Emma is the Head of Historic Buildings at SLR Consulting, a noted academic, a best-selling author, and we'll come on to that in due course to help explain the title of this podcast. And we're going to talk about the heritage industry and some of the challenges which heritage consultancies are finding. So, Emma, delighted to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you ever so much.
First of all, shall we start by just looking at the role of heritage consultants and archaeological consultants, what they do and what they add to the process?
Yes, many people ask me that, actually. So what we do, it is actually a very important part of the whole heritage and, I suppose, cultural heritage, really, broadly speaking, but an important part of the built environment sector, really. So in short, what we do is we tend to write reports to accompany the planning process, if you will, whether it's pre-application or whether it's full planning. So particularly if one has a listed building, we will write a heritage statement to support the listed building consent. So that's at a very sort of basic level what we do, but it's far more broad than that. We get involved, hopefully, usually, at the beginning of the process. So if one is altering a listed building, a historic building, a building within a conservation area, or even wanting to put a new build near to a listed building or within a conservation area, we will get involved right from the beginning. And we will look at what are the constraints and opportunities, what are the issues that are going to be related to heritage or archaeology. And we provide design guidance to say, you're in a conservation area. You need to look at what the character and appearance of that conservation area is. So what materials are you going to use? How are you going to construct that building? What gables are you going to have on the roof there to make sure it sits harmoniously with that? And then all the way through, as we say, we're sort of there to hold the hand, if you will, to ensure that it meets the MPPF, etc., which we can get onto. But essentially, policy, statute and guidance that it's been adhered to at every step of the way. And then when it comes to archaeology, say, for example, there's a proposed development, there's a new build, say it's residential development. That ground has never been broken before. What's the archaeological potential? We'll look at the reports for that. We'll do a sort of desk-based assessment, and then we might even go on and project manage geophysical survey to see what might be under the ground, and then project manage trenching to see what's in the ground, and we go from there. So we are really there at every step of the way of development.
How does that role interrelate with the role of perhaps planning consultants, which teams may have, or the architectural team, which a developer will have?
Yes, so the planning consultants are usually, we may be appointed by a planner, we may be appointed by an architect, but we work alongside. So they're very much looking at the sort of planning process and what needs to be adhered to in that sense. And we will write the reports that go in with whatever the planners might be doing as well. And in terms of the architects, we will be working with them, as I say, right from the beginning, hopefully, to say, you can, I don't know, move that wall, you can't move that wall, you can move the stairs, you can't move the stairs. We can insert insulation, no, we can't. How are we going to make this project more sustainable? All those sorts of things. So we're very much a sort of guiding hand, but what we're focused on, yes, how the alterations are going to be input, but we're particularly assessing the impact, the harm on that, whether it's a listed building, etc. So that's why we are there to essentially reduce that harm.
And when we talk about harm, the legislation on listed buildings and conservation areas is talking about preserving or enhancing, but the recognition is that, particularly with listed buildings, it's not a matter of just keeping things as they are, not changing things. It's about judging impacts on significance. So on a project, how do you go about thinking what significance is for the particular assets?
It's quite a tricky process, and it's rather a subjective process, I suppose, which is why my job can be interesting at times, because what you might assess as significance, I might not. But I suppose the way we tend to do it, we try to be as objective as we can do. And what we are determining is the asset's significance. So the reason that we're doing this is to determine the harm. But simply put, significance refers to the value or the meaning of an asset. What are its inherent, its special interest, its qualities? What makes it significant? Why is it there? Why is it a listed building, etc.? Those are sort of broken down into several values, which are architectural, historic, I still like to use aesthetic, or artistic, and archaeological. So we're looking at all the elements that may make up the value of that particular asset. And what we do is we go through those, we assess them. Does it have architectural merit? What is it constructed of? What are the materials? Is it of a particular style? Is it a vernacular style? Was it built by a certain important architect? And we go through each of them like this. For example, when we look at history, is it related to an important person or an important event? And of course, archaeological is more obvious. Does it contain buried remains, etc.? So we sort of, as objectively as possible, we're thoroughly researching, assessing the sort of material and immaterial qualities of the asset and its position as well, also within the setting. So where it stands, its location, what's around it. Through that, we're trying to construct sort of an evidence base, if you will, for its significance, whether it's cultural, social, etc., to hopefully become as objective as possible.
Could you give an example of a piece of work that you're particularly proud of, where you've managed to help avoid harm to a heritage site?
It's an interesting one. The reason that I'm hesitating is it depends what we mean by harm, I suppose. But going back to Richard's point, though, about this is all about not preserving in aspect. So I should probably caveat before I give an example is we are not, as heritage consultants, we're not there to ensure we are not allowing development. We are not allowing change. Change does not equal harm. I should say that. Now, of course, development and additions and alterations are part and parcel of what makes a building, if you're saying a building, significant. Just because something was added in the 16th century, does that make it, and I know this is a bit contentious, but does that make it more important than something added in the 21st century? Where do we draw the line? So that's the reason why I hesitated. But I can think of quite a few where we have stepped in to ensure that harm, I suppose, in the wider sense, wasn't implemented. And one particular one, which is an interesting example, was a great country house in Lincolnshire. And it actually, unfortunately, it has been downed by fire pretty much. It sort of went up in flames a few years ago, and it's been so much vandalism and people entering the site. It's a very large estate, really, in the middle of nowhere. And where we came in was to stop further harm. And what I mean by that is further harm to what remains, but also to see that site actually be developed. And so I'm twisting harm a little bit here, but the reason for that was nothing could have been done with this site. It was a registered park and garden. It was a listed building, but there was new build very close by. There was a previous MOD site on the land adjacent to it. And for years, the owner had not been able to develop the land, and it was just going to rack and ruin is the way I would describe it. The reason that it couldn't have been developed was because it was listed. And so we were there saying, we've got the shell of a building. What do we do then? Does it still hold significance? And this is where it gets very interesting. It has historic significance, yes, because it's been there for a long time. It's been there since the Tudor era, actually. There was a previous iteration of the building. Does it still hold architectural significance? It's just the shell of a building. And so what we actually did was we came in and we got a listing enhancement. It was listed as was, I should say as well. So as it was when it was that country house. And we got a listing enhancement, which classified it more as a ruin. And therefore, what we've been able to do, because it was categorized as a ruin, is develop the site. I know that's probably not what you're expecting, but the reason for that is we've saved it from just being left to rack and ruin. It's not doing anything. The client can't do anything with it, the owner. And the actual site can be developed into a great big leisure ground as well. So that's an interesting one.
That's a fascinating example.
It's a challenge of finding solutions which also work with what there is. But talking about an objective assessment, that is the sense of what is significant, something which varies with time, that things which were not seen as significant even 10, 20 years ago are now seen as more important.
Absolutely. I mean, brutalism is a great example of this. I went to the University of York, which is just full of brutalist architecture, and I certainly didn't appreciate it when I was there at the time. But since, part of the university campus has been listed, and I wouldn't have, but people do love that brutalist architecture, which really was not seen as anything, I would say even 20 years ago, really. So with the passage of time, of course, and I think that goes again back to my point, is we tend to, there's sort of that nostalgia, I think, and we tend to idealize very much the past. And we see the future as very much sort of subordinate to that, I suppose, if anything. We don't see it as of holding as much value often as historic fabric. And I'm not saying by any means that modern development is better than historic development, but that doesn't mean we should stop change. So I think absolutely this is the point, is with time, structures that we're building today will be seen as of value. Perhaps not.
Well, hopefully those who are involved in projects are, amongst other things, involved in doing projects which will be seen in future as being of architectural and historic value. In terms of changes, one area of change is in terms of direct alterations to heritage buildings and so on. What are the particular challenges you're coming across at the moment as to what should or shouldn't be done?
One of the main challenges we are seeing is actually a lack of consistency in responses. And what I mean by that is it's quite difficult at the moment if a client comes with us to say, we want to alter our Grade 2 listed building, we want to put an extension on it. We need a new kitchen extension, for example. I can think of a client I'm working with at the moment, Grade 2 listed farmhouse, and they want a kitchen extension. And it's been almost impossible to do. And you would think, well, it's just a small kitchen extension to a Grade 2 listed stone-built farmhouse. But the reason for that is there is just what one conservation officer may say is very different to the conservation officer down the road in the planning authority next door. There is a lack of consistency in response, as I say. We're also finding it very difficult because it's just a very difficult sector, given that there is not a lot of expertise coming through, because a lot of the experienced conservation officers have left the profession, and so you get the younger ones through. And I think everyone is so worried about making the wrong decision that decisions are therefore not made. So rather than looking objectively as possible at, is this addition going to harm the significance of this building, really? Rather than doing that, it's no, there will be harm, period, whether it's less than substantial or not. On the lower end, whether or not, therefore, we will say no. And I think that is the most frustrating and difficult part at the moment, because it means even the most simplest of alterations aren't getting through. And therefore, more and more, we're going to appeal on these. So I think that is the most difficult. It's just, I think in the positive sense, clients are coming to us earlier on so that we can give design guidance, design advice. We can recommend that is a staircase which holds significance. They won't allow that to be removed, that sort of thing. But it's a very tricky sector for us at the moment.
It's been a real theme that heritage properties need to be allowed to evolve if they're to survive as homes.
Well, that's half the problem, I think. And given also that I think there's this stigma that historic buildings are seen as problematic and that they are, inefficient, whether energy or financially. And with the responses being so difficult, with planning being so difficult to get, with LBC being quite difficult to get, that stigma becomes greater and greater. Whereas we are doing more and more work in the sort of retrofitting field. We're looking at, how can we retrofit a building? How can we make it more sustainable? How is it more energy efficient? And they can be just as energy efficient as modern buildings. They work in a different way, but they can be. And I think it's sort of breaking that down and educating as well to say, actually, they're not the problematic structures that perhaps are, but it doesn't make it any easier with the way the sector is at the moment.
Well, are there sort of twin challenges? Because one question is, do you need, for smaller works, do you need consent at all? And the second is, if you do need consent, do you preserve and enhance and justify it? Is it that problem is sometimes of debating whether or not you need the consent and getting consistent advice from the local authority, whether that's the case.
Yes, if it's structural, you will need consent, in short. That's the broadest way to look at it. If you're making any significant changes, you will need consent. If you have a Grade 2 listed building, now I should make a point here because we do get a lot of people saying, oh, it's Grade 2 listed, it's only the exterior. Well, no, it's the entirety of the building. Oh, this isn't listed, it doesn't say that in the listing description. So I should really caveat this by saying, regardless of its designation, whether it's Grade 2 star or Grade 1, the entirety of the property is listed as whatever it might be. Whether it's contained in the listing description or not, it is also covered by that listing. And the reason that so many listing descriptions are, I suppose, so brief, so broad really, and incorrect in a lot of respects, is because they were done to sort of preserve our assets post-war. Post the war, what have we still got? What is our building stock? And a lot of them were sort of done by drive-by listings, didn't go inside, or they used Nicholas Pevsner's Buildings of England, his book. So that's why it becomes problematic. But if you're doing anything structural to a listed building, it needs consent. If you are replacing like for like, I'm thinking if you have timber windows, you've got parts of it are crumbling and you just need to put a splice in there, repair like for like, that wouldn't need consent. And the majority of sort of cosmetic things don't need consent unless you're painting your listed building, I don't know, your timber frame listed building yellow or something, you might do for that. But on the whole, if it's structural, it needs consent. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, the old sort of, you can have a spectacular mansion, Grade 1 listed in 1950, and you've got about 3 lines from somebody who never actually set foot there. And it's only the more recent listing descriptions which are actually informative about what's actually important. But even then, that's not comprehensive. Now, another area which dealing with heritage terms is the effect on the setting of a listed building or a scheduled monument. How do you go about thinking about the setting issue?
Setting is a very tricky one. The setting is, I would say, even more subjective than anything we do, really. So you are looking at whether this setting contributes to the significance of that particular asset. So that's what we're essentially saying. Now, the trickiest setting analysis or assessment often comes when we look at churches. And this is obviously my particular field of expertise. And I know that I've said things on social media, for example, and I've put out a question: does the setting of a church contribute to its significance? Now, and I'll use an example. You have a church that's in the middle of a rural area, because this is usually what happens, up on a hill, just say a small hill, and someone is wanting to put a modern development, residential development, right next door. And of course, you will often get the sort of general response is, there will be an impact on the setting of that church because its setting contributes to its significance. That rurality, that sort of idyllic, picturesque location, that forms part of that church's significance. But does it? Does it really? If you took away that setting, if you took that church and plunked it somewhere else, would that church not still hold its significance? Is the church's significance not contained within its 4 walls? That church is a representation of heaven on earth in stone and glass. We also get this as well if you have a church near to, I can think of a site we're doing at the moment, which is next to a country house. There's a walled garden right behind the east window of a church. The walled garden is built higher. And one of the responses was that you'd be able to see, if you put something in the walled garden, you'd be able to see it from the east window. Well, the church is obviously much lower than the walled garden, but who is looking out of the east window of a church? The east window is not to be looked out of. It's to light the altar, but it's also that the stained glass is there as depictions of, biblical scenes, etc., etc. Stained glass was never meant to be looked out of. So I think that's one particular example of how setting is so difficult to define. And also, where does setting end? Where does the setting of a church, where does the setting of a building end? Which is why setting can be such an issue when it comes to development within or near to a building, near to a site, because it is just the most subjective. But I like to look at it from that perspective, is actually, what was that building made to do? Was it made to be looked out of, etc.?
And you can't pause any kind of evolution of the landscape. And that's why we've got say, for example, in London, I suppose, little pockets of fascinating churches and all kinds of, very interesting buildings in amongst other new developments, which certainly I would say are no less interesting because they've been built around.
No, St. Mary Axe is one of the greatest ones right next to the Gherkin. It's that sort of quintessential London photograph, I think, that everyone takes, is this juxtaposition between this great modern structure and this historic building. Is that church any less significant? I think it's probably even more so, actually. I know that's probably controversial to say, but really, people know about that church now because of that, because of its renewed setting, revived setting. And also, modern building is seen as a sort of negative, modern development negative next to a church. But if we think of most churches and castles, etc., they were built right up to the walls, usually of a church or a castle. You had timber frame buildings all the way around there, etc. Canterbury, for example, built all the way around the walls of Canterbury Cathedral, the priory there. So why are we not allowed to do it now?
Is it a question? I mean, setting's been looked at. It comes to one is sort of views from the heritage asset, you say from a church, from inside the church, you're not looking out at the church. Some of these views from the development towards the heritage asset, some of it is into visibility, where you can see the development and the heritage asset. And that's quite often been an issue on sort of the wind turbine cases and churches and so on. But in that case, is it a question of the church's contribution to the rural landscape, as often with the tower or the spire being the most prominent feature in the built rural landscape, and the competition that some modern development may create with that?
It is a very tricky discussion, this, but even historic England do suggest that, well, they do use the term small-scale development, and they suggest that it's essentially fine because there is no impact on significance. But as long as it doesn't compete as tower blocks or wind turbines may. But they state that even then, such an impact is more likely to be on the landscape values of the tower or spire rather than heritage values. So I find that particularly interesting because a lot of the time as well, we're, in my opinion, conflating landscape and heritage really is how much does that sort of landscape contribute to the significance of the church? Again, it goes back to exactly what I was just saying. And you're right that a church tower, for example, would be the landmark building and should have been seen, for pilgrims visiting and visitors coming from near and far. But if you put something next to it, does that church still not do its job for that reason?
One area amongst your many expertise areas, Emma, is in terms of churches and cathedrals, and your quite brilliant book, Heaven on Earth, are the Lives and Legacies of the World's Greatest Cathedrals. It's come out recently in paperback. I have to say, if people can get hold of the hardback, I think it's even better in hardback because the fabulous photographs look even more superb there. But Emma, do you want to explain to us what you've covered there?
Yes, thank you. Well, Heaven on Earth, The Lives and Legacies of the World's Greatest Cathedrals is my book. And it's 16 of what I believe are the world's greatest. Now, I say the world's greatest. A lot of them are in Europe, and that is not entirely by happenstance, but that is because it focuses predominantly on the Gothic era, which I believe is the most dramatic, impactful, significant era of ecclesiastical building. So we're looking at sort of 12th century right through to the 16th. And for us, of course, in England, with the break with Rome, that's when sort of it stops. And I look at 16, so I'm looking at everything from the sort of birth of Gothic. If we think of a cathedral, we often do think of a Gothic cathedral, York Minster, Canterbury Cathedral, those sorts of things. Or if we go to France, Chartres, Saint-Denis, Sainte-Chapelle. And that is simply because it was just during this sort of 12th to 16th century, there was just this sort of cathedral crusades, this sort of wave of cathedral building where sort of every single town was, at the time, before it had its cathedral and it became a city, but every single settlement was trying to get closer to God. They were trying to build heaven on earth and make every single church that they built bigger, larger, and higher than ever before. So this was this whole cathedral crusade of building. And so I start with northern France, is Saint-Denis and Abbot Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis, where we tend to think Gothic as we know it was born. So Gothic comprises 3 ingredients, if you will, architectural ingredients. So we have flying buttresses, rib vaulting, and what's the third one, Richard? Because you've read my book.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Stained glass. Anyway, we'll keep going.
Stained glass. I was thinking the incredible blue of the Sainte-Chapelle windows, where as a young paralegal in Paris, I used to just pop in. I used to have to do the run to the law court, and I would pop into the Sainte-Chapelle and just be transported for a moment by the incredible stained glass.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think most of these buildings do have beautiful stained glass, really. I mean, that's when stained glass as we know it was again born. But going back to Saint-Denis, I mean, we tend to think of Abbot Suger as being this father of Gothic, but Gothic didn't arrive just fully formed. We had all these ingredients being implemented in different areas, and it just happened to be that they were all put together at Saint-Denis, and then they went outwards, and we came over to England as masons were moving here, there, and everywhere. So that is what it's about. But the book really is not just an architectural history about cathedral building. It's very much about the people behind it, who was constructing them, and the sort of very interesting tales behind why, how they were funded, how they were built, who is behind it. And there's a sort of continuing cast of characters, if you will, that seem to come up time and time again for each of these very interesting buildings.
And there also seems to be a bit of sort of competition, it's a bit of one-upmanship. Is there a bit of sort of getting the pilgrim trade into us rather than the guys next door and so on? It's not just building heaven on earth, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the majority of these, well, all of them needed their own saint or their own relic. And the reason for this goes all the way back to the 9th century, and that you had to have a relic to essentially sanctify your altar, to make your church sanctified. And so then pilgrims would come to visit the relics that you had, and particularly if you had your own patron saint. You had your own saint, literally his body within that particular cathedral. And so pilgrims would come far and wide to visit these saints, to make offerings to the saint in the hopes of a cure of an illness or a miracle would occur. This is obviously before modern medicine. And so you would, I don't know, you've hurt your leg, so you might journey across to Canterbury to see Thomas Becket in the hopes that he would cure your leg, and you would make an offering. And in short, the amount of money that, pilgrims were spending funded the construction of these great cathedrals. And, these cathedrals were not built apart from Salisbury, which was, in a very short period of time, 38 years. But apart from that, and Chartres too, but they were built over hundreds of years, over centuries, and they were constantly changing, evolving, developing. The more money that they got through the doors, the more that they would elaborate their buildings so that they could beat, Joneses down the road and outdo them to get more pilgrims through. And it just went on and on. And there was a great rivalry. Yeah.
After all, there's nothing you wouldn't spend to save your soul.
Exactly. And that's the point. It wasn't just even the offerings. If you were wealthy, if you were noble, you might buy your own chantry chapel. Winchester has a great load of those. You would have your own sort of monument to yourself, your epitaph, and then a sort of little chamber around it. I mean, those would be millions in today's money. You might buy a stained glass window and have a little version of yourself popped in it. You were funding the construction of these great edifices because you were worried, you wanted to save your soul. That is exactly the point. Yeah.
And it's still happening today. It was a theme in the Archers recently.
Really?
I seem to recall.
Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Buying a stained glass window of one's own family.
You would. Yes, although it's not as easy now. You have to go to the CBC, which I'm on, if you want to have your own stained glass window in a new design. You can't just make it up like you used to be.
Well, Richard and I have got the contact for when the moment comes for us to save our souls.
Exactly.
Emma, thank you very much for talking to us Heritage and talking to us about Heaven on Earth. I said it is absolutely fabulous.
Thank you very much.
And look forward to whatever follows next on that, and also to all the work which you're doing in the heritage sector and bring things forward.
Thank you so much, Emma, for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.